everyone, and welcome to today's program on maintaining healthy relationships during the election season. And this program, we've got a great panel of speakers lined up for you today. And we did pull this together very quickly, but we've got a great lineup for you, and we're hoping to have a really lively discussion because we know that this topic is on many people's minds right now. This really actually grew out of some conversations with our internal Healthy Relationships Initiative team about looking at the climate and the politics and just the tension building through election day. And we were just wondering, we've kind of asked ourselves, what can we do through the Healthy Relationships Initiative to offer some information and support to people as they're sort of navigating the relationships in their lives. And we're talking about all kinds of relationships today. We're talking about couple relationships, friendships, family, parenting, extended family, coworker, any type neighbor relationships too even can be impacted. So we've got a great panel, like I've already mentioned, and I'm going to go ahead and get them set up so that you can see them on your screen. But we have really assembled an interdisciplinary panel of experts from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, which is where our Healthy Relationships Initiative is housed. Our mission through the Healthy Relationships Initiative is promoting happy, healthy, and safe relationships of all kinds. And so we're really grateful for the speakers who are joining us today. And before we jump into our discussion, I'm going to ask each one of them to go ahead and share a little bit of background information about themselves to help set the stage for what their perspective is coming into our discussion today. So I'm just going to go in the order that everybody's listed on my screen. And so Jeremy, that means we're going to go ahead and start with you. So Jeremy, thanks for being here today. And could you share a little bit of your background?
Sure. So I'm Jeremy Rinker. I'm an assistant professor in the Peace and Conflict Studies Department at UNCG, where I study conflict, social conflict, and particularly around issues of marginalized communities. I've spent a lot of time in India studying Dalit communities, former untouchable communities. And I guess I would say that my interests research-wise have really shifted to kind of the role of collective historical trauma and kind of collective trauma or social trauma in general in conflict situations. So. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Jeremy. Jason, thank you as well for being here today, and you're next on my screen, so if you could go ahead and introduce yourself as well.
Sure. Hello, I'm Jason Herndon. I'm a licensed psychologist, and I am the director of the UNCG Psychology Clinic, which is a community clinic serving the Piedmont Triad area. We've been around for over 40 years. And so I provide clinical supervision there and also work with our students on sort of making sure that the clinic is as supportive and affirming a place as we can.
Thanks, Jason. Julie, thank you as well. Could you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Julie Mendez-Smith. I'm a professor of psychology, and I also work in the chancellor's office on campus climate. And so part of my job is to think about how organizations work together and thinking about, the overall healthy climate that individuals encounter as students, as faculty, as staff members, and also how we interact with the community. So I'm really interested in this topic and helping us just think through together how to keep our relationships safe and productive and healthy for us all, kind of during, a tension-filled election season.
Thank you, Julie. And Jeff, last but not least, you are the last one on my screen. So we're glad you're here with us today too. And if you could go ahead and introduce yourself as well.
Sure, thank you. I'm Jeff Colbert. I'm a senior lecturer in the political science department here at UNCG. I'm a two-time alumnus of UNCG, been teaching here for now more than 3 decades. My focus is on American policy. I teach intro American government, public policy, courses that look at the interaction between religion and politics as well. And so as a person of faith, I try to talk with my students about how we should discuss issues and trying to have disagreements without being disagreeable. And normally it works pretty well. But this election season is a challenge, that's for sure. So glad to serve on this panel with this distinguished group of friends.
All right, thank you all. And I will say when we first decided we wanted to do today's program, we really sort of handpicked each one of you because we knew you'd each have a really valuable perspective to share. And for those who are just of course, joining us now, we had a very lively warm-up conversation to this. And I can tell you that if the warm-up discussion is any indicator of what the rest of today's conversation is going to be like, which we're sharing with you, you all are in for a treat with a lot of helpful information and to really get you thinking about what's going on right now and what you can do to keep your relationships as healthy as they can be right now. So we're going to kick this off actually with a question for you, Jason, with your mental health professional psychologist background. What have you observed about how this year's election season has been impacting relationships?
Yeah, so I think what we see a lot of is just sort of this, we were talking earlier in our warm-up around this idea of layers upon layers, right, of issues that are all sort of happening at the same time, converging at the same time. And so it's not just politics, it's also COVID, it's also, police violence, it's also the responses, right, that we're seeing and that type of thing. And so I think what we're seeing is just sort of increased tension, increased conflict, and a variety of different types of relationships, just because everyone, I think in some ways, is just sort of emotionally exhausted, right? Emotionally drained, emotionally run down over the past several months, especially, but also, a couple of the last few years.
Yeah, so we're seeing a lot of things converging at once here. I think, Jeremy, did you have some other thoughts that you wanted to share on this around how the election season is impacting relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I think just in terms of family relationships, right? It becomes hard because all of us probably have someone in our family who has a very different political view than we do. And so trying to figure out how to have those conversations, oftentimes over social media, which is never actually really the best way to probably have those conversations. And so, and just following up on what Jason said about emotionally kind of charged and emotionally drained, I think it's interesting because I think oftentimes we tend, and people even in my field in peace and conflict studies tend to kind of think about conflict and divorce it from emotions. And I think that emotional component is really critical because we show our affect in conflict, right? If we're in front of people, we show that to people and people see what our emotions are, even if we're trying to hide them. So yeah, I mean, I think that's an important kind of thing for us to think about in terms of relationships is that even though we might not be saying our emotions, saying, hey, I'm angry about this, or I'm frustrated about what you're saying, they're still saying it.
That's really true. So this is not just a intellectual issue that we're talking about, but it's also one that people have very deep-seated emotions, and that really plays out in their relationships as well. I did want to share too, because I should have said this in the beginning, but I have prepped our panelists today that today's discussion is a nonpartisan discussion, and so we're really trying to focus on this from our different somewhat from our different intellectual backgrounds and areas of expertise professionally, but also potentially bringing in some of our own lived experiences as well. So with that added context, I think that you both have given a really great introduction to some of what we're seeing, and I know we're going to dig a lot deeper into that. So Julie, do you think that the current election season has had a greater impact on relationships, or is this similar, but it just feels different because it's happening right now?
Yeah, I think, Christine, that's just such a great question. It might be kind of a both and, yes, this is a very intense election, but it is true that we have had other moments in history that have been equally tense or important milestones, perhaps. I can think of a lot of passion in the last election around possibly electing the first female president, for example. So when that didn't happen, there were certainly groups that were looking toward that event as a milestone in American history. Similarly, I'm not a political scientist, but I was on college campuses when President Obama was elected. And so intensity is this really interesting emotional word because it signifies something deep felt, but it doesn't really have a valence to it. So something can be really negative in intensity, and something can be positive in intensity. And I think that's important to keep in mind because people are very passionate about being involved in the election and participating, and they feel that intensity, but there are others that do not feel that way and are less engaged. And so I think that creates unique challenges for relationships during an election season where someone's saying, get out the vote, another person is saying, wait, what are we voting for? It's kind of hard to understand either side.
Those are all a lot of really good points, Julie. And Jeff, I've been really interested as a political scientist to pick your brain on this topic too. So what do you see as some major trends in the political climate that really are impacting how people's political viewpoints are playing out in their relationships right now?
Well, I think there are many. I would focus maybe on two, at least for this first thought. One is just from a political perspective. The left is much more left and the right is much more right than they have been, at least in recent history in American politics. I've lived long enough to remember when both parties would have some moderate members as well as some less moderate members. And there would be some folks who could bridge gaps, who could come to some compromises. But as both parties, to be honest, have sort of exorcised more of the moderates out, it makes it a much more polarized political conversation, and it's much more difficult for folks to cross the bridge, if you will, or maybe as we were saying in the warm-up, maybe it seems like it's harder to cross that bridge. That some of those bridges probably can be crossed, but we find it difficult to see how to do that. And then something that's already been mentioned once before, and we talked also about the warm-up, is just the realization of social media. We have these constant conversations conversation is not the right word. These constant communications which are taking place, and social media tends to reward short, typically somewhat negative or abusive might be too strong of a word, but certainly very polarized conversations. Everybody wants to see how many likes they have, and there's just not as much I think thought as could go into a conversation. I remember, I'm old enough to remember when you would see somebody and chat with them, and unless you have one of these telephone thingies with a line attached to it, you wouldn't be able to communicate with them again for a couple of days. And now it's just the social media makes interaction so easy and so present that I think sometimes, while it can be good, I mean, there are a lot of really super things on social media. And I use it on a regular basis, I think in a very positive way, but it's just really easy to turn negative in any of the social media platforms. And because it is so instantaneous, I think that's part of what's different. Julie, we're talking similarities and differences. I think that's a very much a difference from say 10 or 15 years ago.
We also talked briefly about this added piece that I want to kind of bring in here to this part of the discussion around, maybe how we were raised around talking about politics. And, I shared that when I was growing up, you did not talk politics. You were really raised like in polite conversation. You do not talk about politics or religion. My parents would take me to the voting booth, but we had to stand outside. There was no way we were going into the booth with them. I guess we would go to the election place, but we wouldn't be allowed in there because it was secret. Like, never would I know who my parents voted for, which I understand is different. I was just wondering if anybody might have any other either experiences that you've had or other things, that you saw. But, the piece that I would add to that too is that I think growing up in that sort of climate where there have been norms in the past where you don't talk about politics in polite conversation somewhat leaves you unprepared, to learn how to talk about politics in a polite, diplomatic way. So does anyone have any other ideas that they want to share or experiences around that?
Well, I'll just say that I shared earlier that I grew up in the DC area, Arlington, Virginia, and the local news was really the national news. I mean, as a local news person came on, they were talking about what the president was doing, where he was, where, that kind of thing. And I think that influenced me as a young kid. I also grew up in a family that I would say was politically active and civically engaged. And so they were out, at meetings, and from a kid's perspective, I thought it was always a little strange because my parents were gone a lot at night because they were out doing things, right? And so that provided a kind of a guide for me in some ways, that's what, we talked about social justice issues, so my perspective is a little different in that way. We had that kind of that guide or model for us.
Yeah, I think I was reflecting earlier and I had forgotten this, but one of my parents was on the school board. And to be on the local school board is in some ways a political role, right? And I don't think I saw that as a child, but similar to what Jeremy's talking about, you know, being gone at night and being involved in meetings and sort of thinking about, I wonder what they're discussing. I wonder what the problems are that they're figuring out. And so, you know, I think it's really helpful in this kind of conversation to think about how we learned about what politics mean and civic engagement more broadly, and the rationale for, you know, going out and being engaged with others in your community is Jeremy was talking about, this larger kind of public good to create something that's better for all of us. And not everyone has the same experiences when they're growing up. So that's really helpful thought, Christine.
Yeah, my home background was, Christine, sort of similar to yours. I don't remember my parents ever telling me I should not talk about politics, which would be really ironic that I then turned into a political scientist, but it was not talked about. It wasn't like a verboten subject. It was just something we just never spoke. What transformed me in terms of talking about politics was that I was in high school in Raleigh, in junior high and senior high in the mid to late 1960s. I went to the only truly integrated high school in Raleigh, and we became sort of a laboratory experiment without realizing we were, as 16-year-olds, of how is a group of Black students and a group of white students going to figure out how to make this thing work. And we did, but it was largely by talking about stuff and trying to understand what folks are going through, because I mean, I did not attend a school with anyone of color until 7th grade. So I grew up very much in a segregated society, and then have changed pretty dramatically because of the experiences, and not because of necessarily what parents did or did not do.
I would say, I guess for me and my experiences, you know, I think I had one of more, there are things that we talk about at home, right, among family, and there are things that we talk about out in the world, right? And so, you know, I was really interested to hear what Jeff was saying in terms of sort of being in this sort of integrated, like desegregated sort of new environment, right? I think throughout my educational career, I was often the only or one of a few children of color, right? And so I think that there was almost this code switching of, you know, it's okay to talk about these types of things and your political beliefs at home with my mom and my family. It is less okay to share those, right? Or you're likely going to encounter people who have different viewpoints, different values than you do out in the world. And so I think that, just to highlight a point that Julie made, is it's so important to keep in mind in terms of flexibility and generosity, that we're all kind of approaching these issues from different backgrounds and different learning experiences. I think your point, Christine, about sort of the skill sets that we all have is a really great one. I think often when we initiate these conversations, we expect that everyone is at the same place, at the same level that we are at, and that's just not necessarily true.
Yeah, that's really one of the things that's standing out. And I just appreciate everybody sharing some of your experiences. I know we probably could talk a lot longer about that, but just to give a little highlight. But you know, that seems like a good takeaway point for people who are listening to today's program, is like, you know, to kind of understand, regardless of where somebody's coming from, you can probably assume that their experiences growing up and talking about politics were not the same as yours. And they may have had some very positive experiences, some very negative. It might have been something that they talked about very frequently or not at all. You know, so having empathy. We're going to talk about what relationship skills we can bring to this conversation. But, you know, having empathy and understanding that you may be very comfortable talking about, you know, X, Y, and Z, and another person may not. It might be enough for them to even just share a little snippet of their opinion. And before we move on to, but I think this is a really good segue to our next question, is, you know, Julie really brought up the perspective of like a school board. And I think when this election, obviously there's a presidential campaign, there are some really key national election issues that are probably on the forefront of everybody's mind. But I'm really glad you brought that perspective in as well, because even though, of course, we have this national political dialogue, we see it play out at the local level. And even the school board, like you said, that is very political. You know, anybody who has been watching school board meetings, not just in this community, but virtually anywhere, or, you know, talking to people who've been doing so, like politics are playing out there too. You know, so you have this intense national perspective to go along with, you know, what's really a very intense local perspective often as well too. And I think that is a great segue into the next thing that we were going to talk about, and that is back to you, Julie. You know, your work, especially in recent years, has really focused on organizational climate, especially in the areas of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So how do you think people's experiences in larger social systems, but still kind of in their, you know, in their local community, like their workplace or their neighborhood, how does that play out in their relationships?
So that's a just really wide-ranging question to unpack. So I just want to talk a minute or two about some of these concepts that I think we try to use to, you know, highlight what might be going on at the individual level. So one of the things that you said is organizational climate or a systems level climate, right? So what that means for people is that there are leaders and they're kind of in charge, and they sort of get to establish the tone in a workplace or in an organization about the rules and norms that kind of guide behavior and attitudes. And so the argument in favor of diversity, this sort of, I'll put it in quotes, business case for diversity, is that the more different sorts of ideas and people you get into leadership, the better sort of the conversations will be about different perspectives on issues. And eventually, if all those voices are listened to, you'll come up with the best solutions because you've considered the problem or the issue from a wide range of viewpoints. Now, there are a lot of threats to that value of diversity because there's something called inclusion. And unfortunately, the way society is set up now and the increasing polarization, we don't tend to associate with many people that disagree with us. We as humans like to find people that agree. And when you agree with me, I like you more. And so one of the things that we hear all the time from organizational, you know, CEOs, people like this, is sort of find someone who doesn't agree with you and see, you know, what can emerge from that type of conversation without judgment, without, you know, I'm better than you, or, you know, your ideas are less relevant than mine. And that's where we start to get these emerging consensus views. The last term that you mentioned is equity, and I think it's really important to go back to our opening remarks. In this pandemic in particular, we've just revealed massive inequities across different groups that have always been there, lurking, racism, social, economic issues. Right now, we're all joining each other by Zoom. The ability to have access to technology and just to come together and have this type of conversation is really an equity issue. We see it with our students now. Some are still trying to work. They're frontline workers. We have nurses in our classrooms, teachers doing remote learning and raising kids at the same time. So all these like different factors that make it potentially, you know, harder for us to understand each other's reasoning and points of view. So even your neighbor, if you can't socialize with your neighbor because of the social distancing, you know, how are you going to really get to know their thoughts about something as complicated as the election and politics? So I think we just have to keep in mind that any group that you're a part of, you know, there's a culture to that group and a flow to that group. And you want to be thinking about, you know, how is my group inclusive of other people's ideas and backgrounds? And, you know, maybe throw it to Jeff because he was talking about just changing the composition of his middle school experience, you know, was really transformative for him. So those are the kinds of things that we would be thinking about. And that's a lot of what I do in my work at UNCG.
And I think I'm going to, if I hop on with Julie for just a moment, I think part of what's intriguing about that is that in one of my classes, we talked about the changes in American society since, say, 1940, 1950. I encouraged them to drive through old neighborhoods in their homes, which were built at that time. Pretty much every house has a porch because that's pre-air conditioning. So when it got hot, you went outdoors and you met your neighbors. You know, we've done this in my church where in a class we go, so how many of you could name the 10 closest people living close to you? and there to be this silence in the room because we realize we really don't know our neighbors anymore. So where those connections get made is in our organizations. It's really not in our neighborhoods anymore, which I think is really sad. It should be, but I'm as guilty as others. I'm not blaming other people. But it's so much, as you were saying, Julie, where we work. Those types of organizations are so defining now of what kind of relationships we have.
I find that to be very fascinating, to go along with Julie's point also about how we have a human tendency, let's call it, to go kind of congregate with people who are like us, you know. So whereas in neighborhoods, which often are going to be people who are somewhat like us, at least on certain variables, but then, you know, if there's going to be probably more choice going into that. So we're sort of further losing that ability to relate to people who are different than us and might have different viewpoints. And I have to, you know, it's not funny, but it sort of was funny when I ran by a house one day, or two houses actually, with really competing, almost like hostile yard signs, you know, like right up against the property line. And I just thought, wow, you know, what is the dynamic like between those neighbors during election time, but also not during election time, you know, kind of, yeah, it truly was sort of a very interesting thing to see. So anybody else have any thoughts about that, around kind of how ourselves in these kind of within our community social systems play out?
Just following up on what you just said, Christine, like the idea that we get so hardened into these kind of identity positions, right? That those signs are signifiers of an identity, right? And we get stuck in that. And for some reason, we can't seem to want to get out of it and talk about, hey, what do we both like to do? Like if you're a neighbor across your fence, you know, oh, you like to cook out too. I like to cook out, right? You know, I mean, there's other things that we could relate on, but oftentimes that sign and that signifier of our identity takes over. And I'm not even gonna approach that person and talk to them because I know where they stand, right?
And it's really interesting, like the example that Jeff said about most of his students don't know their neighbors, you know. So if we don't know our neighbors and then all we see is a yard sign and it's either somebody that we are in favor of or not in favor of, how much does that then become, you know, the deciding factor as to whether this is somebody that, if I see them out in my neighborhood, that I would want to talk to them. You know, I think that there's a lot of us that probably are very guilty of that right now, you know, not knowing your neighbors and judging them solely on politics.
Right.
Yeah, and also going back to one thing that Jason was bringing up earlier, that not all workplaces are inclusive where people really can bring their authentic self. We talk about this word authentic a lot, but, you know, am I bringing all the pieces of things that are important to me to my workplace? Or is there just, you know, some aspects that, again, are maybe not acceptable to discuss, or I'm not sure how people will feel about these things. And so how do we create pockets within workplace, climate, schools, civic organizations, you know, the idea of a neighborhood town hall? I mean, it sounds a little quaint now. People are so busy, but that was the function, I think, of those systems, is to bring people together and say, what are we going to do about the pothole on the corner of Joan Court, which is the street I grew up on? You know, this is the problem. Who has an idea how to fix it? Those are things that bring people together, and I just think we've lost our ability a little bit, and it can be taught. Those skills can be taught. Listening to the voices that are quiet, not dominating others, you know, not engaging in so much disagreement, but where is there some agreement? But I think we're not thinking about how to develop those skills in this present day climate.
I think too, the last thing that I'll sort of add to this is another thought about this, that when we're talking about neighborhoods, that's one kind of relationship, but kind of going back to something that you said that I don't want to miss is that in other contexts, there are real power differentials or hierarchies, especially, you know, like in a neighborhood, presumably we're all kind of on equal footing with the people that are closest to us for the most part. You know, on the other hand, at a workplace, if you have a boss or, you know, colleagues or if you're a student in a school and you're a professor, or, you know, whatever those contexts are where there may be some real power differentials that can come into play in terms of how open people feel about sharing their true selves or their true viewpoints. So Jeremy, you know, you specialize in conflict resolution. As you were sharing, you've done work in India. I know from other work that we've done that you've done a lot of work related to violence in communities. You know, so we know there's just a lot of conflict right now, you know, and so I think you bring a really interesting perspective because you probably better than any of us really understand conflict and tension, especially at, you know, kind of the personal to community levels. So what can we learn from you and the conflict resolution field to help us understand better maybe the nature of these political conflicts that we're seeing right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I would start by saying conflict's not a bad word, right? I mean, I think we tend to think about conflict as bad, and yet there are positive aspects to conflict. That those things we've been talking about neighbors having conversations and dialogues. I think, you know, to go back to what Jeff said, that the neighbors and the lack of civic space, or the shrinking of civic space, has been one big issue. I think the other thing that strikes me over the course of my own experience is and just watching television, even the move, you can watch ESPN now, and it's not necessarily a dialogue about the two sports teams. It's a debate about the two sports teams. No, he knows this and he does this, and you know, and they literally like 2 minutes of debating back and forth between each other. And so I think we've been taught, to go back to what Julie said, we can teach this stuff, but we've been taught that that's the way to communicate, that's the way we have to get our point across, and we get stuck in, I mean, the kind of basic mediation skills, we get stuck in positions, and we don't go to the actual underlying interests or values that we have, right? And so we often talk in mediation training about getting past positions to the underlying interests that the parties have. And so that creates a kind of dynamic where we're not really listening to the other side. It's just, no, this is my position. And then the other side saying, no, this is my position. And we're talking right past each other. And so my own research is kind of focused much more on those stories that we tell. And I find that fascinating in politics, the stories, the narratives that parties try to tell. I feel like some parties have fallen under the trap of other people's narratives, right? And they don't often create their own, right? And so this idea of kind of, and I'm thinking of one of my former professors who's written about kind of narrative analysis and narrative and conflict, and she talks about we don't just need to understand narratives, but understand that we stand under. She kind of plays with that word understand, that we stand under narratives, and that they can control us in ways, right? That they can shift our identities, our attitudes, and our behaviors in particular ways. And so I think we need to find ways to share our stories with each other, and that's those civic spaces that we used to have, they have shrunk. I mean, there just aren't as many of them. And so finding ways that we can bring those into the classroom, that we can bring those into the church setting, that we can bring those into the organizational setting. Like you said, systems, Julie. I mean, yeah, creating systems where it's, for lack of a better term, cool to actually engage with the other and to talk about interests and values. I think you know the and maybe it goes back to the kind of 90s or even like 80s and Reaganism and the kind of family values thing. It turned people off in some ways to even having a conversation about what are my values and why do I hold these as dear. The minute we start to get there, I think lots of Americans kind of tend to the minute we start to get to the conversation of values, it quickly can shift to politics. And so to go back to what you said earlier, that some people were brought up in a way that, oh, we don't talk about that in polite conversation. And so I was thinking about it as you were talking, because I have a neighbor who's quite religious. And I was putting up a yard sign, in fact, in my yard, and having a conversation with her. And ironically, her husband went to school with Roy Cooper. So I know they're Cooper supporters, right? And so I said something about the presidential election, and you could sense there was a tension there. And her response was, oh, well, God will make the choice. And I thought, well, okay, from my value system, that no, like we have agency, right? And so, I left it at that. I said, okay, I'm not gonna push this further, but and I think it's that uncomfortable space you were talking about. Like I didn't push it further because I wasn't sure exactly how far I could, right? And I live across the street from this person, so I have to, be able to engage with them on other topics, right? Yeah, so I think, I mean, just to go back to the question about conflict resolution field in general, and thinking of ways to move the conversation to a dialogue as opposed to a debate, and thinking of ways to really let our emotions and our empathy come out. And I don't think that a lot of public discourse today allows for those spaces. And so we have to figure out ways to teach our students. And that's what I do in my field, is try to figure out ways to teach our students how to engage with things that they're not always going to agree with, right? But that can be conflict can be a productive thing for those people who are engaged in it. And you may not agree, you have to figure out how to, for lack of a better term, stay neutral. I don't like the neutrality term. I talk about impartiality, right? And kind of keeping equidistance from parties, to figure out how to sit in that space and not get, and it's hard because sometimes you're like, oh my God, I can't believe that person said that, so.
Yeah, it's tough. I think today's culture, I was really thinking a lot about my work in the family and marriage and couple counseling field. And, one of the most basic things you have to help couples or partners understand in a couple relationship is like, you don't have to agree to just try to understand, you can really work hard to try to understand someone, and you don't have to set your own beliefs, to the side. But I think that in many ways, it's very difficult. It's even difficult. I have a really hard time with that sometimes. Like, I have to actively remind myself of that if I'm discussing politics, especially, but any topic that's sort of a heated conversation, that it doesn't have to be about what's right or wrong. It can be, help me to understand you better. Like, where are you coming from with that? That's one thing that I've really tried to do when I see things that I immediately disagree with. I try to step back and say, where's this person coming from on this? Or what about their life experiences has led them to this?
Well, and I think tolerance has become a kind of a dirty word to some extent too. It's like there's some assumption that if I am tolerant of other people, I have to agree with them, right? I can tolerate somebody and think, my God, their ideas and value system is completely different than mine, and I will never think in that way, but I can still show a tolerance towards them.
Jeremy, I think you made an excellent point, maybe without necessarily intending to do so, when you talked about your conversation with your neighbor. Because part of the damage of social media is, not the damage, one of the problems of social media is that people feel as though I have to engage. You said something, I have to engage. And you made the point, your neighbor said something and you chose not to engage. We can come back and talk again. I mean, they're still across the street from you. You can have another conversation. It doesn't have to be right this minute. And certainly in all kinds of family relationships, it's just having a sense of we need some space. I was with my stepson, those years ago, we were having a political conversation. We disagree on a number of things. And we normally have really solid, good, amicable conversations. And this one was moving in a different direction. And I said, we need to stop. You're my stepson. I love you. We need to stop. We might come back and talk about this again. And he didn't want to stop at that moment, but he did. And we're fine, but sometimes you just have to let things quit and then maybe hopefully come back to it later and be able to do something with it.
I think that's a great point that I think just deserves repeating, right? Which is, I think, one of the things that we see in post-social media, right, that we maybe forget is that it's like, not every opinion is worth sharing, right? Like, you don't always have to give voice, right, to everything that's moves through your head, everything that you feel, right? And that's not to say that you should never express the things that you think, your beliefs, your feelings, that type of thing, but not every situation, not every context is appropriate to share every thought, every feeling.
Great point.
Yeah, it is a great point. And that's, I mean, and I think that's the thing about conflict, that where it gets its bad name is that oftentimes the dynamics get to that point and people say things that they really wish later, wow, I wish I hadn't have said that, right?
Mhm.
There's a lot to be said for the right timing for a lot of things, expressing opinions, having discussions and debates. You know, Jeremy, your reference to your neighbor made me think maybe that's a good conversation to have like after election day, you know, between this and the next presidential election, to say, let's talk about this, you know, because it's heated right now. It's more heated. It's more likely that it's going to escalate into conflict than it might be at another time. So, you know, Jason, we've kind of been touching on this, but I want to really address it. Like this, there, with all this tension and conflict that we are all truly, you know, living under for many reasons, but especially with this heightened election season. Talk a little bit about how is this impacting people's mental health and emotional health, and then, you know, how might that play out in the relationship piece as well?
Absolutely. You know, I mean, I think that certainly all the general things that people think about, right? So, conflict with other people is challenging, right? It's emotionally difficult. It can be draining. It can be activating. You know, when you're angry and you're angry for what feels like a long time, that is not good for you, right? Either emotionally or, you know, and we're getting more and more research out, right, that shows that sort of the more that we experience stress, the dose of stress that we have over the course of our life is also not good for us physically, right? In terms of our physical health and well-being. You know, I think that increased conflict, you know, is really, you know, and I want to be thoughtful, right, about the way that I use the term conflict based on, you know, what Jeremy was just talking about, right? But this idea of increased conflict, I think also sort of highlights that there is a little bit of a difference there, right? And so I think what I mean by that is, I think when we think about increased conflict, the image that many of us have in our brain, right, is like me yelling at my neighbor, right, about whatever political topic we're talking about. And that certainly can be the case sometimes. But I think something else that, you know, is important to give voice to is that sense, that feeling, and the conflict and the distress that comes from feeling like I am not able to share. I'm not able to push back. I think this gets to this idea that, you know, Julie was mentioning earlier, sort of systems and the culture of maybe the place that you work, right, or social groups that you belong to, right? It feels like there are consequences to sharing what I think and how I feel in this very challenging time. And so I'm holding on to those emotions, right? I'm pulling them inward instead of finding opportunities to sort of release them. And that too can be really detrimental, right, to how people are doing and feeling. And I think the third point that I would make then is just, you know, as I was listening to everyone sort of talk, something that came up for me is the sense of identity, right? And how, you know, someone made the comment earlier about how we use these terms, conservative and liberal or Democrat and Republican or whatever it is, as these sort of stand-ins, right? As shorthand for, if I identify as a conservative or I identify as a liberal, then all of these personality traits, right? All of these belief systems, right, are subsumed under that idea. And I think what's important to keep in mind about that in terms of your mental health is that's absolutely externally shaped, right? So it's like, oh, well, if I say that I'm a Democrat, what do other people begin to think about me, and what parts of that are true and what parts aren't? But there's also an internal component to that, right? If I want to identify in this way, does that mean that I have to start thinking about things in a certain way, even though I don't think about them that way now, right? And so that sort of identity conflict there, right, in terms of like, how closely do I align with sort of the umbrella term that I ascribe to, or that people are sort of ascribing to me, right, is also, I think, something that's important to keep in mind.
There's
That
a lot.
identification piece, I'm sorry, Christine.
No, go ahead, Jeff.
That identification piece is interesting, Jason, because we talk about in political science, and currently in America, about 40 or 45% of Americans either register or characterize themselves as independents. But if you look at their voting records, 80% of that 40% vote identifiably with one political party or the other. So they actually are Democrat or Republican, whatever the case may be, but they don't want to identify in that way. And they'll tell their friends, oh, I'm an independent, you know. But if you ask them who they voted for, you know, okay, maybe you're not quite so independent, you know.
So Jeff, I think that's really interesting because it just is suggestive to me that younger people are increasingly unhappy, I mean, maybe frustrated, maybe unwilling to sort of go along with these categories that, are intended to sort of signal to people like, hey, I'm like you, or hey, I'm not like you. And, it could be that the younger generations are going to come up with a way to work around these issues and come up with a more creative approach. And we certainly see some evidence of that, at least on different college campuses. I mean, some of the largest movements to date have sort of been spearheaded by folks, organizing and coming out, and for all different types of topics that people are concerned about. So maybe it's a topical kind of focus that brings people together, more in the election season than the sort of like which party is winning and which party is losing. Because anytime you move away from this sort of winners and losers, I think it will be helpful. I also think, the country is changing, the demographics of the country, places people live. I've read a lot during, the COVID-19 pandemic about, what are cities going to reimagine themselves to be as these highly dense, living situations. Maybe they will change in some way. And so, how the broader societal changes come to bear on our interpersonal interactions. I think what Jason is expressing is really important to think about. How do you participate? How do you become engaged? And we would be worried about people, as a psychologist, we would be worried about people who are withdrawing from that interaction, not finding places or pockets of support, or feeling overwhelmed by the conflict so much so that they are retreating from that. And we've certainly seen some evidence of that in people who are just overwhelmed by some of these moments. There's been a lot of trauma and loss in people's lives over the past few months. So I think that's just really important to think about. It's not just the people that we see arguing that we should maybe step in and say, hey, can we support you? But it's also the people that are stepping away from this.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I just going back to that identity crisis idea, it goes internally and externally. I think I think that's an excellent point to raise, that we need to be engaged. I mean, as I was listening, I was thinking, this is the argument for a need for a third party, right? I mean, we have two parties and we get so stuck in these kind of identity positions that it strikes me that Jeff was talking about these independents. It strikes me that that's a fertile ground. I'm actually kind of surprised politically that there hasn't been a real viable third party candidate rise up. And we've seen it here and there over the last 20, 30 years. But yeah, so I think that's interesting in terms of like I was just thinking about how does that play out in terms of what if people are only given the two choices, right? And not and they don't, and they feel like, oh, I'm just going to disengage, then yeah, traumatically they oftentimes act in and do things bad to themselves as a way to self-medicate and do other things that the psychologist would be able to tell you more about than I could. But I find that interesting on a collective level. Like, how does that then play out across society? And I think it goes back to the lack of trust in institutions, and I think that's caused a lot of stress and trauma for people who had faith in institutions and now are beginning to kind of scratch their heads and wonder whether that was a misguided faith that they had in those institutions.
Yeah, I think that there's just, it feels really heavy for a lot of people on many levels right now. And so, I know I've spoken with people who really feel depressed about the current, like they've actually used that word, or they feel hopeless, and I think that really is striking to me, just to see how deeply it's impacting people. And there are some very real mental health, emotional health impacts that people may be experiencing right now. And so, of course, we always just want to remind people to really take care of yourselves, be proactive about caring for your mental health. Sometimes you do need to turn off the news for a little bit, or find safe places, find safe places with people who maybe you do know agree with you, that you can just vent and release some of that, so that you're not just carrying that alone. And we'll talk more about that later too, as we kind of get into some other relationship skills and other things that people can do. But Moving into our next section of our program today, I almost debated doing like a fishbowl and putting some different scenarios into the fishbowl and just drawing them out one at a time, but decided to settle on 3 specific scenarios that I wanted to present to you all as panels for today. But I could think of many, many other specific examples of very specific relationship experiences that people might have in the context of our election season right now. So just want to kind of open this up by running through a few different scenarios here. So first of all, our first scenario is, what could someone do if they get overwhelmed by some sort of intense and possibly even personally attacking dialogue about politics on social media, which we know is a very rare occurrence these days, right? No, just kidding. We know that that happens all the time. So there's many people impacted by this. So Jeff, we'll start with you on this one. How can people handle those social media attacks or intense debates that feel hurtful?
Yeah, well, I think part of it depends upon what kind of conversation we're talking about and where the conversation is coming from. Part of the social media platform I spend the most time on, I'm most familiar with, is Facebook. I have an Instagram account, but I follow, I don't put anything on there. So in Facebook, the way it works is that I see obviously posts by I got like 2,100 friends or something, whatever, but you also see lots of their friends post as well. And the first thing that I do is think through, to be honest, do I care what this person thinks? This is not someone that's in my arena. They may think I'm politically ignorant. They may completely agree with me, but the reality is I don't know who this person is. And therefore, do I really care? I mean, I generally care what people think. I think that's, part of my system, if you will. But if I'm feeling as though somebody's just really, being very abrasive about an issue, my first question is, do I even care what this person thinks? And if I don't, then turn them off. I try not to unfriend friends of mine on Facebook. I've done it once. But Facebook has this great hide feature that you can use. And I've got friends that when they post something about our faith, for example, or folks I went to high school with, or folks who, work with me here at UNCG, and it's those kinds of posts, and I read them and react. And if it's a political post and I know already where it's going to go, I hide, because it's, I'm pretty developed in my beliefs, as I imagine a lot of us are, and most people watching this probably are. And I like to read, if it's a rational, if it's a thoughtful post by somebody who disagrees, I'll read that all day long. If it's someone who is not being that kind of response, whether I agree with them or not, then I tend to put them away, because that's just, I want to have dialogue. I want to hear people who are different from me. I want to hear people who think the same way I do. And all that helps me continue the process of becoming whoever it is I am. And, different issues come up. So what do I think about those? And you're going to have conflict. And that was one of the things I wanted to mention when I thought about this. We've always argued about politics. There's nothing new about this, okay? The way we do it, the platforms we can do it is new. And part of the maturing process is learning how to deal with folks who are different, learning how to deal with folks who maybe aren't quite as nice or calm or whatever. But then there comes a point where it is becoming abusive, it's becoming attacking. And then I think you have to start disengaging. I think that's the wisest thing you can do at that stage for your own personal health.
Yeah.
That's good. So some good kind of questions you could ask yourself, like, is this, just the level of this relationship one that I want to engage in? Can I learn? Is this person approaching it from a respectful, kind dialogue? And then what can my response be? Is it engage back? Is it hide? Is it block? Is it unfriend? Is it just to kind of peacefully walk away? So, I think that those are some really good kind of practical takeaways. Anyone else have any thoughts on the social media piece before we move on to the next scenario?
I just wonder, I'm curious, because I think the social media piece has kind of created this situation where we blame and then immediately move to shaming the other, person who doesn't agree with us. And I just listening to Jeff, I was thinking, I think for my generation and probably yours, Jeff, like we can do that. We can say, okay, you know what, I'm just going to hide this person or unfriend them or whatever, right? I'm just going to move away from it and not engage. But I wonder, like, I have a younger son, and like just how much connected they are online and that kind of the social and social media. I don't think it's as easy for him to be able to just go, nah, I'm going to move away from that. It's like there's almost an impulse to re-engage, and there's research that's been done that says the phone's addictive, right? I mean, Steve Jobs didn't want his own kids to use the phone because he knew how addictive they were. Right? So, I mean, I don't know. I agree. It's we do it on a different platform, but I just wonder how that platform has really, especially generationally, really changed the way in which we do that. Like moving immediately from oh, I'm blaming you for my problem to like, you're horrible and I'm going to shame you and put up a nasty picture about you or troll you or whatever it is that you do on social media, right?
Well, the best thing I've heard in this entire panel is that Jeremy thinks he's in my generation. So I became instantly younger by an entire generation. I think this is great.
I just don't have the gray hair.
For this panel together. I can leave now and be happy. But I think that's a great point. And part of, I think I said this in our pre-conversation. My generation, I think, has done a horrible job of modeling for younger folks how we can have engagement with each other and not turn to that. And I think it's a real pressure for parents current day. I've got grandkids in their 20s and their teens, and one's 4 years old. And I'm constantly dialoguing with them about how to disagree and how to have conversations. And even at 6 years old, no, that was wrong and it's your fault. And it's not my fault because you're getting time out. It's just, you did it, So I think you're right. In the current age, there's a much greater stress on parents teaching their kids how to respectfully engage and sometimes how to disengage. But I would agree, absolutely, it's a lot harder today than it was in my generation. Or our generation, I'm sorry, excuse me.
So Jeff is going to be walking with a little added boost of confidence for the rest of the day today, which is great. We always try to just help people however we can through the Healthy Relationships Initiative. So let's go to our second scenario then. And Julie, I'm going to start off with you for this one, but certainly anyone else feel free to chime in. So what should people do when the topic of politics comes up in a professional setting or in the workplace, especially when you discover that somebody's got different views than you do, and maybe they're not being very respectful of yours?
Yeah. So boy, this is a really big topic, and I'm going to just give myself a disclaimer to say 20 seconds of advice is probably not going to be sufficient. This is a big challenge, right? Because we want to have workplaces where people have access and opportunity. We all have different talents and backgrounds, but we're not particularly good at coming together and figuring out where does work stop and where do personal relationships start, and what does it mean to be, in our workplace, we would say a colleague. What does it mean to be a good colleague? What does it look like when someone's acting kind of like a bully? We don't have a lot of language and structure around, how to engage in these public conversations about topics, Christine, you talked about earlier, that for a lot of people should be private. And now we're all on Zoom, and it's incredibly hard to have an informal conversation. This is actually really enjoyable today, but this isn't what work is really like for a lot of people anymore. And certainly, bumping into someone in an elevator or, going to a parking garage and having a conversation by your car, that's not really happening. So what I would say is that invitations are always a really important strategy for any social interaction. So asking permission, is this something that we actually want to talk about here? I noticed that you're talking about who you're voting for. Should we talk about this after work? Or is it okay if I listen? I don't know who I'm voting for, and I'm curious about your opinion on this. So this idea of invitation and being curious on what other people are talking about is a nice strategy to avoid both the awkwardness of, oh, wait, we probably don't have the same views. But then too, like, I'm signaling I might be open. Like, I'm actually curious about what your thoughts are. I've seen a lot of this happen, not necessarily in the election context, but in dialogues between parents trying to make decisions about their children's remote learning and return to school. I think it's fair to conclude that there's not one dominant view or correct view about what should happen to education in the middle of an infectious disease outbreak. So it leaves people with this opportunity to say, well, I'm doing this and this is my decision. And someone else saying, I'm doing this and this is my decision. Well, both decisions are possibly right for the certain circumstances, but it feels incredibly awkward to feel like one family wants to return to school, whereas another family does not. And you sort of feel like you're in a conflict, but really there's just a different reasoning process. So your example just sort of makes me think of this notion that it's not a problem to have a diversity of opinion. It's a problem when we can't be civil and respectful in our discussions about those things. And certainly if someone is being excluded from those conversations, that's going to have a lot of damaging consequences for other things. So 3 or 4 people are very similar in their views, they get together a lot, they have discussions, and the other people in the workplace or the group are left out of that. Well, they're probably going to be left out of more than just the election discussion. So I would worry about that. If you feel like you're being left out, you maybe have to take a step forward and initiate, or to say, what are you talking about? I'd love to listen in or participate. So it's not going to go perfectly well all the time, but I think if people were more curious about each other and inviting each other into a conversation at a certain time and place, that would be more productive than the sort of, scenario that you're putting out there.
Any other thoughts on the workplace?
Sure. I think what Julie said is spot on. And so the only thing that I would add is just the sense that the way in which you approach these conversations also matters. And so I think, a mistake that we sometimes make is I'm initiating this conversation, I'm inviting, right, with the goal of changing your opinion, right, of making you think like I think, right, or at least to stop thinking the way that you think now, right? And so, I think something that was sort of implicit in Julie's message, right, is that it's really not about me convincing you that I'm right, you're wrong, or whatever sort of dichotomy we're trying to fit into at this point, right? It's really more about genuinely listening and seeking to understand what's happening and where these people, you, whoever, are coming from.
That's such a helpful clarification, Jason. I completely agree.
I think too, just also being mindful, like I've always found this among working in higher education, that you have a tendency to assume that you were talking to other people who have very similar viewpoints to you. Whereas I think, in actuality, there's a lot more diversity of opinion across, political and other types of spectrums. And I think that's always really helpful too, because I think sometimes we might assume because we work with this person, we see them every day, we're similar in other ways that, I can assume, so I might approach that discussion more from an assumption that we are similar versus, and we may not be, and sometimes I think we have to kind of check ourselves in that way too. And then I would just add to just the other thought around like the power differentials too, and I think especially for those in leadership or supervisory roles, evaluation kind of roles need to be really beyond, probably almost even like beyond. I loved how you framed that, can I listen in? And that may be very threatening for people who have perceived or actual less, power in those situations too. And I think that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, and good leaders are inclusive, just to elaborate, but good leaders are inclusive in their language. Oh, we're talking about this. Oh, did you see that social media post? That's what we're talking about. So it's not private and it's not secret. And that's what tends to divide people, is that they feel like they're in the discussion or they're out of the discussion. So that's what good leaders can do, is they reveal things, they're transparent, and they're open about, you don't have to agree with me, but I am in a position of authority, and here's how we're going to work together on this.
Yeah, I think that's really good. Acknowledging that piece and that it might play out and really working hard to create that safety. So we're going to move to our third scenario here. So Jason, this one's coming right for you as our mental health professional. What about couples? And we could think about long-term partnered or married couples, or even starting to date, newly dating couples, you know, where each partner has very different political beliefs. Is it even possible for this hypothetical couple in today's climate to make it? And if so, what can they do to navigate those differences?
Yeah, this is such a great question. I love this question. So I think the easy answer is yes, I think it's possible to be in a relationship with someone who has different views, right, than you have. I think we've seen this repeatedly, right, over the course of life. I think, one of the things we were talking about earlier in the warm-up is there's a difference, I think, between everything that I think, everything that I believe is entirely different than what you think and what you believe. That seems less common, right? And at least in a romantic coupling, right? When it comes to this specific issue, right? I see it one way and you see it maybe a little bit of a different way, I think is a more common occurrence, right? Within romantic relationships. I think the other thing to point out is that we are all more than our political beliefs and our voting behavior. And so I think if the only thing that is wrong in your relationship, right, is I feel one way about education and you feel a different way about education, then I think it's worth thinking about whether this is a relationship that's worth preserving, right? No relationship is perfect, certainly, right? Healthy relationships have conflict, right? Have challenges, right? That's okay. I think the flip side of that coin is also true. If this was not a healthy relationship to begin with, if the way that someone expresses their thoughts and opinions is abusive or bullying, right, then again, regardless of the way that that person votes, right, or how that person thinks politically, I think that there's a real conversation that needs to be had around like what works in a healthy and successful relationship and what is absolutely not going to work in a healthy and successful relationship, and so I think just keeping in mind that not all relationships are created equal, right? So some relationships are great and they're worth keeping. Some relationships are not so great, and they might be worth letting go of.
Lots of good points. Anybody else have anything? I have a few thoughts I want to share too, but I would love to.
I'll just jump in. And it's funny because as I looked at that question in a warm up, I think Jason said something like, that's even hard to imagine. And I thought the same exact thing, like, wow, that's a tough one, right? Because relationships are complicated. And I think your point about whether it was a toxic or a bad relationship prior to probably has a lot to do with how those differences might have evolved. But I want to go back to something you said earlier about kind of not getting drug into a debate and really listening to understand, right? So, and Julie said as well, kind of inviting and the curiosity, like those, inviting into the conversation and having curiosity about what the other person's saying. I think all of those things are really, you can disagree. We can agree to disagree, right? But if you're trying to persuade that person to change their mind, it's not going to necessarily go well, especially if it's a deeply held value, right?
One of my all-time favorite quotes about couples is that if two partners are exactly alike, then one of them is irrelevant. And, I just love that because it's a great reminder that actually differences between people sometimes they can be deal breakers, you might say, but other times it's what keeps relationships interesting. And to have somebody who's different that might challenge you, and share different viewpoints. And, the other piece that I just think is important to add as well is that, we sort of talk about politics like your political beliefs as though they are static, like I believe this, therefore 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, down the line, I'm going to have the same belief system, or my partner will. And, in reality, these are growing and evolving and changing things. And people may have, like Jeff said earlier, people may have a tendency to, vote in a particular way or a different particular way. But, from election to election, local, state, federal might be different. And, I think one of the key factors on any dimension of a couple's relationships is can they grow together and give each other some freedom and space to grow in somewhat different ways, or is the expectation we always have to grow and be the exact same, person that we were when we started this relationship. So I thought I'd share that. I think, Jeff, you had something else you were going to add about this.
Yeah, I think where Jason started on it, I thought was just so critical. And we've touched on this a time or two in other questions. Who we are and the relationships that we have is, and this is coming from political scientists, is so much more than politics. I imagine we've all been to conferences, and many of those folks, many of y'all watching, you've been to conferences where you hit some kind of icebreaker and you introduce yourself to the people there. Who says I'm a Democrat first? I mean, does it even show up on the list of things? Well, I'm a Republican and whatever. No, it's just, it is part of who we are, and it's an important part of who we are. But, I'm a Christian, I'm a dad, I'm a stepdad, I'm a grandfather. I mean, I'll eventually get to teaching at UNCG on the list. Who I vote for is like 15 more down. It's just not. So one of the ways of, I think, dealing with these is focus on the things you have in common. My wife and I have relatively different political views, not completely different, not like the question was posed, not that different, but we're still somewhat different. But our similarities are so vast beyond who we're going to vote for in 3 weeks. And so that's what pulls us together and kept us together for so far 32 years. But, because our differences are so much greater. And I think in relationships, looking for those similarities and then learning how to deal with the differences. Yeah.
I think one thing, Christine, that we were talking about earlier, just quickly to add, is that people might vary, not necessarily in their beliefs, but their level of engagement. So how important do you think it is to be politically active or to participate in local issues? And for some families, cultural backgrounds, regions, issues, my first job was at the University of South Carolina, and that was my introduction to military families, military culture. So that comes to mind. So the idea of, people from different backgrounds being in relationships, maybe there's some influence over time where you would be a more like a mentor to say, well, here's how you do research about who's running for office, or here's how you find out about local issues of importance. It's possible that people didn't have those experiences. They weren't, taken to rallies, or they weren't taken to protests. They weren't taken to the polls, as you shared earlier. And so I've always thought for young people, an introduction into kind of what it means to be a citizen and what voting might look like. It's fairly intimidating to vote. If you vote and you're a regular voter, you sort of have these rituals, like you plan to vote and you might get that sticker, or you might mail vote. If you've never done those things, it's just like any new behavior. Figuring out how to do it is a little bit challenging. And so I could see couples kind of differing a little bit on just their overall level of engagement, which to me would be a really interesting kind of conversation between the partners as to why people behave the way they do.
So really keeping that spirit of, again, curiosity. I heard that word earlier. Help me, kind of learn. Can we learn from each other in this? And maybe it's even more interesting to be in a relationship with somebody who doesn't have exactly the same viewpoints. And by the way, just even to say, never would two people, probably two independently thinking minds, think the same, on every single issue or every possible level of political issue. We tend to put it into one presidential candidate or another,
Right.
or one party or another. But in truth, people, just like we've been talking about all along, people's identities, their belief systems, their worldviews are so much more than being boiled down to, just one piece there. And I especially really liked, Jeff, that reminder about we have lots of layers, and really politics are, for many of us, down lower. They wouldn't be if we were saying, who am I? If we were introducing yourself to a new group, you're not going to start probably with your political affiliation.
Yeah.
Plus maybe you're at a political rally or something like that, or a political meeting. And that's one of the things, and that's why we really wanted to do this program, is because just on a personal level, like from the lens of someone who's directing a healthy relationships initiative, it really saddens me, to see that people will like end relationships. They can't navigate this issue. And so sometimes they end a relationship with somebody who maybe adds a lot of other things to their lives, but they can't get through this one thing, or they can't get past it. And so we've got about 15 minutes, a little bit less than 15 minutes left to go. I'm actually going to sort of combine the next two questions on here so we can start to get into, what can people do? Like, what are some practical things based on what we've talked about, based on what you know and your unique lens? What are some of the relationship skills or the best practices that people can apply? Sometimes maybe people do need to set extreme boundaries in relationships and cut those off. And sometimes, how do we work through those differences? So I'm going to start with you, Jeremy, and then maybe just love to hear everybody's thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about a bit how unhealthy these relationships can come. And so from that perspective, I think I would say the way you kind of set boundaries and work with that partner, whether it's a partner or a workmate or a friend, is to kind of be clear with them about, with whoever that is, and for both sides to really be clear that we're going to set aside this time to do it. So like literally setting aside a time, and then the kind of basic conflict resolution skills of like using iMessages and not trying to kind of intuit what they think. And you said this, and I don't agree with this kind of a thing, but more, what is it that I believe? How can I express my values, as opposed to kind of ascribe values to you. I think I say that as somebody who studies this stuff, and I oftentimes get caught in that too, right? I mean, because you get frustrated, and frustration, aggression, right? You get frustrated and you're like, okay, I gotta respond to that, right? And you're not really thinking about, but how does this impact my own value system, and how can I shift my focus back to that? It's easy to say you need to do that, but it's harder to actually practice it.
Who wants to jump in next here?
I can go next, and I'm just imagining that people who might be interested in this topic or listening to our conversation are either really struggling with a specific relationship where this is a real problem for them, or they're just, seeing a lot of this out in the society. And I think I want to talk to the first group because for me personally, I think there's something very different about a deep, close relationship and you're contemplating ending that versus the other tips and strategies that we've talked about in the workplace or even the neighborhood and community. Because in theory, you could find a different place to live. You could find, a better job that fits your needs and values, but you might not be able to find another grandparent. Not be able to find another aunt or uncle that was there when you learned to read or came to your first t-ball game. So those deep emotional connections are the relationships that I'm the most worried about. And I think people really need to ask themselves, are the beliefs that are tied up in the election really worth that loss and those histories? Maybe you just need to think more of a time out approach. Or maybe you need to think about a pausing and less contact and more surface interactions. But before you make a big move that you might regret, to really be thoughtful about what you're thinking about. On the other hand, if you think that people in your life are influencing you and other people that you care about in a very negative way, that's certainly an understandable choice. And so some people are really facing that they have to choose between the values they want to live their life by and the things that they want their children exposed to and the ways in which maybe they were taught or the way that they grew up. So these are really kind of big decisions people are making. I would just kind of encourage some patience and some self-care as you move through this. This is really hard to be around loved ones who may be caught up in a lot of this election conflict. And maybe you can be a person that processes it just a little bit better than some other people in your life.
I think, Julie, that's a great point because again, as we've talked about the I think Jason might have been the first one who said about the layers. Well, that's come back up in topic after topic, and there are layers of folks that it would grieve me to not have a relationship with them, friends and family. And there are other folks that I would not prefer to lose a relationship with them. It wouldn't be a choice necessarily, but as you said, at the end of the day, they're not as critical to my life. And I think another piece of this is to as much as you can, pull yourself away from the rhetoric that's going on. This election, like most elections, is full of hyperbole. Everybody has heard both parties or both major candidates say, this is the most important election in American history. And with all due respect to Jeremy, I've seen a lot more elections than anybody else here. And, I was sharing with y'all earlier, in the midst of the Cold War, we were literally concerned about blowing up the earth. I tell my students, we had calculations of, we can blow up the Soviet Union 22 times and they can only blow us up 21 times. Like, you get multiple times to do this, but that was, we were afraid of someone else and what was going to occur. And other elections before and since then, they all have a level of criticality. Maybe this is the most important ever, but I would have a hard time figuring out how you would know that. And my guess is it's like all national elections, it's important, but it's like the one 4 years ago and the one that will be 4 years from now. It's important. We need to pay attention. We need to be knowledgeable. We need to be thoughtful. But one of the reasons, when I teach American government, I talk about structure, because I tell students, I don't care how much you love or hate Donald Trump. When your hair color is my hair color, he's just a name in a history book. He's a former president who probably did some good things and probably did some not so good things, like most presidents. But you need to focus on the structure of the system, because we're going to have presidents and we're going to have Congresses and Supreme Courts. So that's where you need to focus and not get quite so caught up into, this is the most important thing ever.
Thanks, Jeff. Jason, anything else to add?
Sure. Yeah. I think what really stands out to me here is sort of, again, the way in which we approach these conversations. I think, others have said it really well. Close relationships, close, meaningful relationships, were probably close and meaningful 4 years ago, right? Like 6 years ago, depending on how old the relationships were, right? And so really thinking about, like, in what way has that changed? We have this interesting idea in a certain type of therapy that we practice, and it's this difference between I'm feeling upset and how that is different from the idea that you are upsetting me, right? And so I think it is really important to think about, right, like, where are the thoughts and feelings that you are having coming from, right? Like, I think Julie mentioned this idea, right? If people are harming you, right, intentionally or unintentionally, that's really something to think about in terms of, how worthwhile is this relationship to continue. Relationships are very important. A healthy relationship is a beautiful thing, and simultaneously, no relationship is worth your emotional well-being, right, just for its existence. And so, if we're really thinking about, like, how are people impacting our lives, like, what positives do people bring to our lives? If you can't think of any, then yeah, that's a concern, right? If you could think of a lot, but they just think differently than I think, then, again, it's really worth thinking about how important is that relationship to you? What is the sort of net value, right, that the relationship brings to the table?
Those are all really great points. And I just think we are all really speaking in different ways to just the importance of relationships, and just that reminder that if you've got important relationships in your life, do all that you can, especially healthy relationships or relationships that could be, healthy, to do what you can to not let politics get in the way of them. And I think that's a really important reminder right now with all the tension and conflict. So we're down to just our last couple of minutes here, and I will share with everybody that before we started, I sort of tentatively invited our panelists to potentially come back again for another follow-up conversation after the election, especially as we looked heading into the holidays, where people may be, hanging out with different family members with different opinions. And they all nodded. So I'm going to hold them to it. And so stay tuned to the Healthy Relationships Initiative, and we would share more if and when we are able to put that together. But before we wrap up, I just want to go through our panel and ask everybody to share your final thoughts. What do you most hope people will take away, either as they kind of look ahead to the next few weeks until Election Day, or even, you know, what you might anticipate after that? So let's start here with Jason.
I guess, yeah, my final thought, I think, is really just that, you know, relationships matter, and that each of us as individuals are nuanced, right, layered human beings. And so if we can look into some of those other layers, you know, some of them, those other facets, then we might discover that relationships are possible, right, where we thought maybe they weren't.
Thanks, Jason. Jeff, how about you? Your final thought for today?
I'll echo something that I think was said earlier, if my memory is correct. I think it's a great idea to seek out folks who feel differently from you about issues, but also folks who are willing to converse with you as opposed to argue. I tell my students, I have not debated politics with anybody in 30, 40 years, but I have talked about politics with a ton of folks, and I thoroughly enjoy that. So look for people with different views, and look for folks with different views that you can converse with. And that means there's a chance that you and they can learn something from each other in that process.
Thank you, Jeff. Jeremy, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the takeaways I've been hearing a lot of is kind of we have these differences, there's these layers as we talked about, and just kind of trying to remember that there are structures and systems in place. And so try to restore some confidence in kind of public goods. I was thinking earlier about a story that when I told you guys earlier, I study India. I spent some time in India, and I was there with my kids, and we went to a playground, and my kid was going down a slide, you know, and at the end of the slide, the slide literally jut up a really sharp piece of metal, you know, and I was like, ugh, you know, that sense of public good, that's typical in a place like India. And like having that kind of sense of public good, that we can as citizens do something about things that are not good like that. And, you know, we have public safety laws in this country because citizens rose up and said, hey, this is necessary. We want to privilege this. And so, you know, thinking about how we all are part of that creation of public good, I think is really important for me, and letting people kind of get past the idea that it's the other side that I need to blame for why this is not working, but how can I work together to collaborate to figure out how to increase the public good.
Great, Jeremy, thank you. And Julie, go ahead and close us out here with your final thought, and then I'll share a couple thoughts to wrap up.
Wonderful. Well, I think in our own ways, we've all tried to talk today about perspective taking, you know, looking at the world through literally glasses that are not our own. And if we can do that just a little bit more, it takes a lot of effort to listen to other people, not for agreement with you, but for understanding of them. And I think that's going to build up a better dialogue opportunity for us all to, you know, as Jeremy and others are saying, there are some big problems facing many, many people. And we just need all hands on deck to start to get to work. And whatever issue that you care about, finding people that, you know, are also in your, I don't know, arena, you know, is great, but literally try to invite some others in too, and share with them why you're so passionate about something. If you're not passionate, you're feeling disengaged, you know, just start very, very small. Just start very small. You take one step forward and you'd be surprised at people that will meet you. So for those of us that are doing okay, you know, be graceful and reach out to other people. For those that are struggling, you know, take one step. Healthy Relationships is here for you. Just think about where you are in the sort of grand scheme, and kind of this neighbor to neighbor ideas is sort of what I'll, I think, take away from today as well.
Thanks, Julie. And I just want to thank all of you again for what I think was a really fabulous and informative and thought-provoking discussion. I just woke up today so excited to have this conversation. I think that just personally, like I said, it's been weighing heavily on me, seeing the impact with relationships and on relationships of the election season. And honestly, I think I just needed someone to process it all with. So I'm thankful that you all were willing to come and do that in this forum. And, I hope that, and I really believe that the things that we talked about today can really help people think about this from some different perspectives too. Practicing self-care is important, but it's not enough. Trying to understand people is important, but it's not enough. Understanding the broader social context is important. It's not enough. We really need to, be caring for ourselves and our relationships at virtually every level of this, especially as we head into what's sure to be even more intensity and relationships and in the political climate over the next few weeks leading up to Election Day and probably after it. So thank you all again. Can't thank you enough for this discussion. And we thank all of you for being here today, and we will definitely do our best to bring this awesome panel back together, but hope that you'll share this information if it's helpful with you to help get the word out about this. So thanks everybody again for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.